Today we'll be talking briefly about the separation of East Pakistan, and this is of course the most important historical event in Pakistan's history. When we look at the separation of East Pakistan, we can see that there are different causes for the secession of this wing. And these causes include political factors, they include economic factors, they include military and strategic factors, and they also include the mishandling of the political crisis that erupted in East Pakistan in 1969-1970. So when we look at the political causes, we can basically see that there are three main ones. The first is that Pakistan comes into existence as a constitutional federation of different provinces, and the constitution making process is supposed to then produce a final constitution for the country. Unfortunately, this process gets delayed and then it gets disrupted owing to the fear in the ruling circles of the western wing of the country that a democratic system will lead to a permanent majority of the eastern wing of the country, because that is where the majority of Pakistanis happen to live at the time of independence. So Pakistan's military and bureaucratic leadership, they intervene in the political process, and as a result of these interventions, they introduce various steps that undermine the democratic majority of the East Pakistanis. These steps include the creation of one unit in West Pakistan. They include the imposition of artificial parity of representation between the two wings of the country. And they also include the intervention in politics in order to remove prime ministers from the eastern wing like Khwaja Nazimuddin and Muhammad Ali Bogra and Hussain Surawardi, who are not willing to do the bidding or have fallen out with the leadership of the military and the civil service. Ultimately, this also leads to the disruption of the constitutional process when in 1958, the President of Pakistan, in conjunction with the army chief, General Ayub Khan, decide to abrogate the constitution, and this of course leads to first Iskandar Mirza overthrowing the constitution, and a few weeks later Ayub Khan overthrowing Iskandar Mirza. Once there is military rule in the country, then any hope that the eastern wing might have had for fair play or for due representation is no longer there. There are of course elections that are held under Ayub Khan's military government, such as the 1964 elections, but in those elections you have the universal adult franchise denied because of the basic democracies, and you also have massive rigging, which leads to a very predictable outcome, and Fatima Jinnah being defeated by Ayub Khan in the 1964 presidential elections. So by the mid-1960s, people in East Pakistan have realized that basically they cannot win through any fair political process. And this of course sets the stage for the radicalization of opinion in the eastern wing and the articulation of Mujibur Rahman's radical 6 points, which would turn Pakistan into a very loose confederation if adopted. Now, these political factors are reinforced by very important economic trends. In British India, the revenue share of the provinces and the central government was about even, roughly 55-45 in the late 1930s. After Pakistan comes into existence, the central government federalizes most of the revenues, leading to a situation where the central government is collecting 90% of the revenues and the provinces are getting only 10%. Now, the problem from the perspective of East Pakistan was that East Pakistan was producing much of the country's foreign exchange, and it was also producing much of the country's revenues. However, it got far less in return for its revenue contribution. In fact, between 1948 and 1961, something like 80% of all federal government expenditure and 70% of all development expenditure took place only in the western wing of the country. And this was in spite of the fact that the eastern wing of the country was responsible for our positive balance of trade. It was responsible for most of our foreign exchange earnings. And as I mentioned earlier, it also contributed a larger share of the total revenues. So there was a growing sense of alienation in the eastern wing owing to the economic policies which, as they saw it, were draining resources from East Pakistan for the purpose of investing them in the western wing of the country. We also see this in terms of the divergence in per capita income. So by the 1960s, West Pakistan was enjoying a per capita income of about 20 to 30% more than the eastern wing. And it was also enjoying much faster economic growth rates. Then we can also come to certain military causes, and particularly important in this regard is the 1965 war. Now, until 1965, Pakistan's military leadership said that the defense of East Pakistan lies in the west. And what they meant by this was that in the event of a military conflict with India, West Pakistan, with its heavy concentration of military power, would be able to effectively neutralize India's superiority on the eastern border, i.e. with the East Pakistan. When the 1965 war, however, happened, West Pakistan was barely able to defend itself and East Pakistan was left completely defenseless. That's one of the reasons why that in his 6 points, Mujibur Rahman also wanted there to be a separate military force for East Pakistan and for the naval headquarters to be shifted there as well. So this doctrine was exposed as being unviable owing to the 1965 war. But Pakistan's military leadership and its political leadership did not actually re-envisage or rethink their strategic policy. So all of these factors contributed to the alienation of the eastern wing. The disruption of the democratic process, the denial of the democratic majority of East Pakistan, the various unconstitutional interventions in Pakistan's politics that further deprived the political leadership of its role in government. And then, of course, there were economic causes, growing inequality, i.e. West Pakistan was getting wealthier as compared to East Pakistan, using the resources that East Pakistan was providing. And all of these came together and contributed to growing disaffection in the country. Now, the Ayub Khan military regime was ultimately unable to cope with the rise of left-wing populist parties like the People's Party in the West Wing and the Awami League in the Eastern Wing. However, rather than stepping down and handing over power to the National Assembly, Ayub Khan steps down and hands over power to Yahya Khan. And Yahya Khan, who is then the army chief, therefore takes over as the chief martial law administrator and the president of the country. Now, as the CMLA and as the president of the country, Yahya Khan presents himself as a sort of popular figure who's going to make concessions to the popular sentiment in the country. So what does he do? He does away with one unit, he abolishes interwing parity, he declares that there will be fresh elections on the basis of universal adult franchise, and he promises that in the next Constituent Assembly that he will convene, there will be a simple majority provision through which the Constitution Bill would be approved. Now, Yahya Khan and his advisors were of the view that the elections, if they take place, would produce a highly fractured outcome. And that's one of the reasons why they didn't really meddle too much in the electoral process. However, once the votes were counted and the election results were out, it became clear that the Awami League has emerged as the majority party with about 160 seats, while in the Western Wing, the People's Party has emerged as the single biggest party with more than 80 seats. Now, faced with this situation, the logical step would have been to convene a meeting of the National Assembly. However, if a meeting of the National Assembly was convened, then Yahya Khan's own earlier provisions that a simple majority would be enough to approve constitutional changes would mean that the Awami League would be able to completely have its way. This set the stage for the final crisis of secession in the Eastern Wing, because political parties in the Western Wing refused to participate in large measure in a National Assembly where they would practically have no role. The military was able to use this as an excuse to launch a crackdown on the 25th of March 1971, and once the crackdown was launched and a humanitarian crisis created, it gave India an ideal opportunity to not only arm and facilitate the opposition to the Pakistan government in East Pakistan, but it also allowed India to take full advantage of the humanitarian crisis due to the influx of refugees into Indian territory to paint itself as a champion of humanitarian intervention. So when India finally intervened militarily to end the East Pakistan crisis and end Pakistan's control over East Pakistan, there was a very muted, a very limited sort of international response, and all of the major powers, including the Soviet Union and the United States, accepted the change in the realities on the ground, leaving Pakistan, its ally in a sense as far as the United States was concerned, out in the lurch.